Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'll be starting in about 1 minute to allow folks to log in. Great, we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Rachel Patel, co-director of Systems Change Lab. We're delighted to have you here joining us for this conversation on systems change for people and planet today. So to give you a sense of our agenda today, first, my counterpart, Kelly Levin, and I will give a brief introduction of Systems Change Lab. Before then, we pass over to our research leads who will each showcase highlights of our 5 initial systems today. So those are power, transport, industry, technological carbon removal, and finance. And then finally, our colleague Tappan will help demonstrate our new data platform that can be used to track these systems changes that are required and the actions needed to accelerate change. So first, we wanted to give a brief note on the need for systems change with, across climate, nature, and equity, limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 C degrees, halting biodiversity loss, and building a fair economy for all will require fundamental change across nearly all of our systems. An action that is incremental or confined to one agenda just won't be enough. The global crises we face today are absolutely interconnected. So climate, ecological, health, equity, geopolitical, and beyond. And changes in one system can cause unforeseen consequences in others. So if we are to create this sustainable and just future for all, we'll need to navigate these with a systems lens. We created Systems Change Lab in response to this urgent need for transformational change. But what does that mean? So we thought we would start with a story to help tease this out in an example, and really looking at these beautiful palm oil kernels and looking at how we cannot address climate change without halting biodiversity loss and deforestation. Well, what might that look like in Southeast Asia as a key region for this issue? Palm oil is the leading driver of deforestation there, and it's an incredible commodity. But unfortunately, it's been the leading driver of deforestation in Southeast Asia in the way that's being produced. We all use palm oil, 3 or more times a day. Every time we brush our teeth, we wash with soap, we enjoy some of our favorite foods and so on. And there's no one single solution to stop deforestation in Southeast Asia. We need to change the system. So what does that mean? We need the entire ecosystem of actors involved to increase crop productivity sustainably and without expanding into natural areas. So this not only includes the governments and the purchasers of the palm oil, but also the manufacturers of our favorite soaps, foods, and goods. We also need to look after local livelihoods and ensure actors are armed with mechanisms for good governance and social inclusion and equity. We also need citizens to be aware that palm oil can be grown totally honorably. We need the best scientists in the world that will be with innovative technologies and data frameworks that are transparently measuring the loss of trees in Southeast Asia and are able to identify which of these 1,000+ palm oil mills are honorably sourcing and those that are not, and so on and so on. So you can kind of imagine the kind of system map of this ecosystem that will need all of these actors aligned in this journey together for systems change. So there are no silver bullets. Our solutions must absolutely be a strategic jigsaw puzzle with this systemic approach. So when we think about defining systems change is our working definition of shifting component parts of a system and the pattern of interactions between those parts to ultimately form a new system that behaves in a qualitatively different way. And so, the difference between this approach and others is that many leaders and organizations approach change projects oftentimes with linear models and plans. So if we implement A, then B will occur. But engaging in complex systems is not as simple as this, as many of us know, and a single action can have multiple cascading impacts and knock-on effects. So really leveraging this lens is important. Again, what is that? Another layer deeper, what does that mean? Wanted to just touch on how it might look to think systemically. And we all navigate in interdependent webs of systems every day, all of which have complex interconnections and unique relationships and at different scales throughout the day. So for example, from our family to our broader community, even our nation, and likewise our transportation system, our food system, our cities. So thinking systemically about these and how we navigate them might involve some of the things that we have here on this slide. So seeing the whole rather than just the parts, seeing the patterns of change rather than static snapshots, understanding key interconnections within a system and between systems, engaging different perspectives is absolutely vital, constantly learning and adapting because our systems are adapting and very dynamic. And finally, probing our assumptions for creating change. And so within Systems Change Lab, we look at these three pillars of our work and applying how we do this in a way that can help arm decision makers and pinpoint critical actions to help focus and identify those leverage points to ultimately make their interventions that much more effective. And so Systems Change Lab's first pillar up in this right-hand corner is monitoring. So really looking at determining these points of leverage and the required transformations and deepening our understanding of the system, its patterns, its interconnections, and ultimately identifying the shifts that will be most effective to bring about this system-wide change and tracking our progress accordingly against these required shifts. The second pillar of learning and sharing. So learning what drives change, embracing the complexity of these systems and gathering insights from past and present examples, from place-based examples around the world, and identifying the drivers that may accelerate the pace and scale, navigating the barriers, and also trying to mitigate unintended consequences as well. And then thirdly, the nudging and campaigning aspect of our work is really trying to effectively align change agents in a way to help mobilize action and deeply engaging and collaborating with a range of stakeholders across the system toward this path in which every actor is uniquely motivated and has a distinct role to play in shepherding this change. So with that, I'll hand over to Kelly to go over our systems, data platform, and more.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Rachel. Kelly Levin with the Bezos Earth Fund and co-directing the System Change Lab with Rachel. So what systems are we talking about? We know to limit the worst impacts of climate change, to meet 1.5, to halt biodiversity loss, to build a fairer economy, we're basically going to need to have every major system transform. And this includes how we grow our food, how we power our economy, how we build our cities, how we conserve nature, and more. And these are the ways in which we've kind of sliced and diced the systems, but certainly there are many different configurations. What you'll see here also at the bottom are these kind of cross-cutting transformations that need to happen across political, social, and economic systems. And this is to do with how we finance the transitions, how we evolve measures of economic prosperity, how we govern our shared natural resources, how we ensure that everyone benefits from a sustainable economy. And it's also, even though this is nice little circles, critical to think about how these relate to each other. What are the relationships between the different systems, as Rachel had said? So how shifts in the power system, for example, can effectively engage other systems to transform, such as transport, as more modes of travel are electrified. And within these systems, we've identified these kind of component shifts, and these range from phasing out the internal combustion engine to extending financial services to underserved communities, to shifting diets, to dealing with hard to abate sectors like steel and cement and plastic, restoration of lands. And the shifts together can really work to disrupt the status quo and create system-wide change. And what we're looking at is how much progress have we achieved, and where do we need to be by 2030? Where do we need to be by 2050? And what are the biggest barriers to change and what enables change? Go to the next slide, please. So we've created a new open source data platform as one of the components of the System Change Lab that serves as this virtual system situation room, and it showcases research and analysis and interactive dashboards and data visualization. And our hope is that it helps arm decision makers, helps leaders in the private sector, for example, helps funders, civil society with insights on the progress of our required system transformation, and helps think about where to focus action and how to allocate resources effectively. In a few minutes, you're going to hear my colleagues talk about some of those highlights from the various systems that we have on the platform. And the remaining systems are going to come on board over the course of the year. If you go to the next slide, please. One of the questions that we're asking is, how are we doing? Where are we making significant progress? What's stuck in the mud? Where are we seeing acceleration of progress? What's headed in the wrong direction altogether? So we have assigned progress designations to the various shifts that we're looking at, and thinking through what is the science-based target that we need to reach by 2030 to align with 1.5. How goes the battle, so to speak? Where are we on track? Where are we off track? Where are we well off track? Where are we headed in the wrong direction? And you can see this throughout our platform. If you go to the next slide, please. So here, for example, you can see some of the data that we have for assessing progress on our data dashboard, and you can see historical data and what direction they're headed and the targets for 2030 and the assessment of progress in the little colored boxes. And it's a wealth of information to dive into. If you go to the next slide, please. But critically, in addition to looking at kind of high-level outcomes of how transformation is or is not happening, we also identify the enabling conditions and barriers that can help support or hinder transformation. So what levers can we pull to make durable transformational change? And as Rachel said, there's no silver bullet. It's going to take economic incentives. It's going to take regulation and laws. It's going to take shifts in behavior. It's going to take innovation and unwavering courageous leadership. If you go to the next slide, please. So here, for example, you can see some of the data that we've been collecting. So you can see the number of countries with regulatory frameworks for renewable energy generation, or the number of countries with strong electrification plans, or you can see data on corporate procurements of renewable power, or the number of patents for energy storage. And we've been drawing from the literature and expert review to think through what are the greatest barriers of change and the enablers of change from what we can learn on the ground so far. If you go to the next slide, please. What we answer well so far, how are science-based targets for 2030 being met? What are they? And how has historical progress been towards meeting them? How close are we for being on track to achieving these science-based targets for 2030 in various sectors? To what extent are we overcoming barriers and spurring enablers to progress? But there are several questions that we're going to be exploring, and I'm really excited to dive into this year. First, how do you prioritize action? Where would you put your efforts if you had limited resources, for example? What are the ingredients for transformational change? Where we've seen rapid change, nonlinear change, what enabled that to happen? Where do tipping points lie? And how close are we to reaching them? What are the connections that are most vital to consider so that you pull a lever here and it has impact somewhere else? And what is it going to really take to actually achieve the type of transformation that we're talking about? If you go to the next slide, please. Just to thank our partners, this effort has been really collaborative at its heart. And we've been really fortunate to work with a variety of partners and funders. And with that, let me hand this over to Claire, and we're going to start to dive into some of the findings so far. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Kelly. So yeah, I'm Claire Fyson from Climate Analytics, and I'll be kicking us off first with the power sector. Electricity generation, if you go to the next slide, currently makes up about 1/4 of global emissions, so it's a critical one to clean up. And decarbonising the sector, as Kelly has alluded to, will also be essential for cutting emissions in other sectors, for example, from transport, buildings and industry, as these sectors are increasingly fueled by electricity. That means, firstly, that we need to see a very rapid phase out of coal and fossil gas power generation, as these are very high polluting fuels. Second, we need to see zero carbon electricity generation, predominantly renewables. This needs to be scaled up very quickly to both replace fossil fuels and to meet future demand growth. Third, grids need to be transformed to move away from the centralized fossil fuel systems of last century towards more flexible and dynamic systems based on renewables, storage, and demand management. And all of this, of course, needs to be done while expanding electricity access, creating jobs, and managing the transition in a just and equitable way. And today I'll talk through a few examples of the information that you can find on the Systems Change Lab platform to track these shifts. So in the next slide, you can see here on the left that the share of coal-based power generation has been declining globally. But actually, when we look at overall coal use, this has actually increased by 20% since 2010 as electricity demand has grown. And coal consumption still makes up about 75% of the power sector's emissions. Meanwhile, on the right-hand side, fossil gas-based electricity has been steadily increasing, and it's been the fastest growing source of emissions in the power sector. So neither coal nor gas are currently on track to phase out as quickly as they would need to deliver on the Paris Agreement. We see why progress is too slow when we look at what governments and financial institutions are doing. For example, only around 35 governments have pledged to phase out coal, and the three largest consumers, the US, India, and China, are absent from that list. And many governments are also incorrectly claiming that gas can be a bridge fuel. And meanwhile, most of the largest banks are still lending fuels for fossil fuel exploration and fossil fuel projects. This needs to change. To deliver on the Paris Agreement, efforts to phase out coal generation need to accelerate sixfold, and fossil gas power generation needs to rapidly decline to reach near zero by 2040. The good news in the next slide is that there are signs of progress in the power system that invite optimism. You can see in this figure that the share of zero carbon electricity generation has increased each year since 2012. And actually the growth in solar and wind has in fact been larger than the percentages you see here. For example, between 2019 and 2021, solar grew by 47% and wind grew by 31%, mostly driven by installations in China. But because total electricity generation is also rising, including sadly from fossil fuels, the share of generation from renewables is rising more slowly, closer to around 2% per year. And this needs to accelerate sixfold by 2030 to get us on track to limit warming to 1.5. This doesn't just happen by itself. The continued growth of wind and solar energy has been driven by a number of factors that you can explore on the Systems Change Lab. For example, governments have put in place regulations to incentivize the deployment of renewables, and support for sustainable energy companies has helped unlock economies of scale. As a result, renewable technologies have been competing against or even undercutting fossil fuel power generation. And when we look at where the money is flowing, we see that last year investments in renewables were around 4 times higher than those in fossil fuels, a ratio that's on the rise. And that's good news, but investments in renewables still fall far short of what's needed, and large amounts of money are still going towards fossil fuel projects. And what's important to remember is that unless the power sector gets on track, other sectors that rely on electrification, such as transport, buildings, and industry, will face major challenges. So while the progress we've seen in this indicator is promising, we need to see even stronger efforts by governments and businesses to get on track to achieve the 1.5 limit. And to talk you through one of those sectors next, the transport sector, I'll hand over to Stephen.
Thanks, Claire. Hi, everyone. My name is Stephen Namoli. I'm with WRI, and I'm going to talk to you about transport today. So the transport system encompasses all modes of travel, from walking and cycling to long-range trucking to aviation, marine shipping. It contributed to about 15% of global greenhouse gas emissions in 2019. In the United States, it's the most emitting system, and in the European Union, it is the second most. So to really transform the system to one that is zero carbon, clean, healthy, safe, the world really should undertake 5 major shifts: guarantee reliable access to safe and modern mobility, reduce avoidable vehicle and air travel, shift to public, shared, and non-motorized transport, a transition to zero carbon cars and trucks and road transport, and transition to zero carbon shipping and aviation. While there's clearly plenty to cover in this system today, I just want to highlight for you one important data point that is clearly headed in the right direction, which is the share of electric vehicles in light-duty vehicle sales. Electric vehicle sales in this segment have been really increasing over the past several years, but they really began to take off in 2019. The share of EVs in light-duty sales increased by 60% from 2019 to 2020, and then more than doubled from 2020 to 2021. And then most recently, just about a week ago, new data from the International Energy Agency revealed that 14% of new car and SUV sales around the world were electric in 2022, which represents another 60% increase from 2021. And this is very encouraging. However, without a stronger push, we can really only expect EVs to reach about 40% of sales in 2030, which is far short of the 75 to 95% goal that we really need to keep us on track for a 1.5 degree compatible future. Next slide, please. So there are several factors that can help further encourage sales, including sort of chiefly the improving economics of these vehicles, which is driven primarily by falling battery costs, as well as the proliferation of policies such as zero emission vehicle mandates or phase out targets for internal combustion engine vehicles, which we're seeing, both of which we're seeing starting to grow around the world. There are several of these sorts of milestones in the last decade that have coincided with really impressive growth in EV sales. Next slide, please. But the one that I really want to highlight for you today is another key factor, which is the build out of electric vehicle charging. Although most EV charging is done at home, the prevalence of public charging is important to ensure smooth journeys wherever people need to go. The number of public charging points has been increasing at really an impressive rate, reaching over 1.7 million in 2021, double the number in 2019, just 2 years before. About 1/3 of those are direct current fast chargers, which can fully charge the average electric vehicle in about 30 minutes. It's important to note that EV charging is really a key connection point between the transport and power systems, something that Rachel and Kelly talked about, and that we're also going to be emphasizing increasingly on the platform over the next year. And this connection is not least because of the case for building public charging stations really depends on the availability and pricing of zero carbon electricity. Now, if you're interested in learning more about how we address the various aspects of the transport system, as I mentioned, there are quite a few different aspects, quite a few different subsectors and segments in the transport system. I highly encourage you to see what we have on our platform to build out, especially on some of these other areas such as aviation, marine shipping, active mobility, walking and cycling, and things like that. But for now, I will turn it over to my colleague Anna to talk about industry.
Thanks, Stephen. Hi, everyone. I'm Anna Nilsson from New Climate Institute, and I will give a bit of an introduction to the industry system. So the industry sector is one of the most energy and emissions intensive systems and includes the manufacturing of a wide range of materials that are necessary for sustainable development. So those include the manufacturing of steel and cement for low carbon energy infrastructure, or also chemicals such as plastics and fertilizers. Achieving deep emission reductions in the industry system will be challenging, but it is possible, and it will require the actions that enable 5 key shifts. And if we take a bit of a closer look into those shifts, firstly, an increasing demand for industrial products is resulting in rising greenhouse gas emissions and offsetting mitigation gains. The demand for industrial products can be reduced through circular economy strategies, such as increased material efficiency, material substitution, and demand management. But demand reductions cannot by itself lead to sufficient emission reductions. And that's why the next three shifts focus more on the reduction of the emissions intensity of these industrial products. So secondly, even though it has less potential compared to in other systems, such as transport and buildings, there is still room for increased energy efficiency in industrial processes. And those could deliver about 10 to 20% of emission reductions, particularly in the short term. Thirdly, because the industry sector is highly energy intensive and reliant on high temperature heat for many of its processes, decarbonizing the energy supply will be an important piece in achieving deep emission reductions. Currently, most of that heat is generated using solid fossil fuels, but about 50% of the fuel used for energy in industry today could already be electrified using commercial technologies. And then, of course, decarbonized when coupled with the decarbonization of the power supply, as Claire discussed earlier. Fourth, new solutions for the decarbonization of cement, steel, and chemicals are needed. The production of these materials does not only require a high temperature heat and generate energy-related emissions, but these chemical processes required for the manufacturing of these materials also generate process emissions, which are the kind of result of chemical reactions rather than the combustion of fuels. Fifth and last, we also include here methane emissions from oil and gas production under the industry system. So even though the production of fossil fuels needs to decline drastically, increased efforts to reduce methane emissions from their production is needed while they're being phased down. And next slide, please. So if we then take a bit of a closer look into some of the indicators that we analyze on the platform, I will start here by taking the steel industry as an example. So steel production is responsible for about 7% of global carbon dioxide emissions. Its production is very emissions intensive, not only due to the high temperatures that are needed, but largely due to the need for coke coal as a reducing agent. So this generates process emissions. And even though there are less emissions intensive technologies for producing steel, new capacities of the inherently coal reliant production routes, which is the blast furnace based routes, are still being added, as you can see here in this graph. So new capacities of blast furnace based production have risen in recent years. More than half of added steel capacity between 2010 and 2020 were blast furnace based. And due to the very long lifetime of these plants, about 40 years, these risk locking in carbon reliant technologies for several decades to come. Next slide, please. And one of the most promising decarbonization technologies for steelmaking is where green hydrogen is used as a reducing agent instead of coke coal. So to further promote the way of producing steel, green hydrogen production needs to be significantly scaled. Green hydrogen is also one of the key decarbonization options for other industrial materials, such as fertilizer production. And even though green hydrogen is currently produced at very low levels compared to the fossil fuel-based hydrogen, the indicator is well off track to meet the 2030 target, and it's been increasing rapidly on a year-to-year basis, and increased almost sevenfold between 2010 and 2020. Governments here play an important role in promoting the adoption of new technologies such as green hydrogen production, and we can see in one of our other indicators that the number of governments that published green hydrogen strategies are increasing. So from 2 in 2019 to 26 in 2021, which is a positive development. And on the platform, we look a bit more into these kind of enablers, indicators where we try to find kind of early signs of transformation. I would really encourage to have a further look into those if you're interested in the industry sector. That's it for me. I will hand over to Katie. Thanks.
Thanks so much. I'm Katie Lebling. I'm with the World Resources Institute, and I will briefly present the technological carbon removal system. So carbon removal is a bit different from the previous systems that were presented, which involve emissions from key economic sectors. Carbon removal is instead a suite of technologies and approaches that remove carbon dioxide directly from the air to help clean up past emissions. Carbon removal is needed alongside deep emission cuts to help us reach global climate goals. The most recent IPCC report concluded that all pathways that limit temperature rise to 1.5 C require carbon removal to some extent. And so in this system, we just have one shift, which is to scale up technological carbon removal. And so as noted, carbon removal is not one thing, it's a range of technologies and approaches, from activities that are pretty familiar, like growing trees, to more novel things like direct air capture machines that scrub CO2 from the air. The system I'll talk about today covers just these more novel technologies, and we include tree restoration and other nature-based solutions in the land system. Importantly, we'll need both nature-based solutions and these novel technologies for a few reasons. We don't really have enough land available to just rely on tree restoration, and it's in our interest to develop as broad a portfolio as we can, because all of these approaches and technologies have trade-offs, and we don't want to put all our eggs in one basket. So as you can see here, the current level of technological carbon removal happening is very small compared to what we expect to need by 2030 and by mid-century. At the same time, carbon removal technology is a comparatively new industry. The IPCC's 2018 special report on 1.5 degrees Celsius estimated that 100 to 1,000 billion tons of carbon removal will be needed by the end of the century. And this helped set in motion the industry that has grown from almost nothing just 5 years ago, back in 2018, to a well-accepted component of climate portfolios and the recipient of billions of dollars of federal funding and hundreds of millions of dollars in private investment. And the ultimate amount of carbon removal we'll need is inherently tied to what happens in other sectors. If we don't reduce emissions very fast, we'll need even more carbon removal, and vice versa. If we can reduce emissions drastically in the near term, that can help minimize our reliance on carbon removal in the future. And of course, we don't want to have to rely on high amounts of carbon removal. So it's in our interest to try to minimize that as much as possible. So this is to highlight that, or this chart here is to highlight that while progress to date on carbon removal is far lower than what we'll need, there's a lot of momentum building in the public and private sectors, particularly in the United States and several other countries. And we can expect or hope to see this turn into much greater progress on the ground in the coming years. Next slide. So one key enabler of progress in the technological carbon removal sector is public or government investment in research, development, and demonstration of carbon removal technologies. The government has a key role to play here because carbon removal is largely a public good, and because the government is a key funder of basic research across lots of new technologies. So our analysis shows that the number of countries with government investment in technological carbon removal, RD&D, has grown in the past few years. And I'll just note this metric is not meant to say that all countries should be investing in CDR, RD&D today. I think there's clearly a distinct responsibility among developed countries that have done the most to cause the climate crisis to play a leading role in developing and paying for these technologies. And of course, complementary to this metric shown here is another metric on how much funding there is in total going toward carbon removal, RD&D. As one example, funding for carbon removal, research, development, and demonstration, RD&D, in the US has grown from almost nothing back in 2019 up to 140 million this year, plus an additional 3.5 billion over 5 years to build 4 million metric ton per year scale direct air capture plants in the US, and several billion more for CO2 transport and sequestration infrastructure. So some really significant investments to help jumpstart these technologies. Other enabling factors that would help accelerate the scale up of carbon dioxide removal include deployment support, such as tax credits for developers of CDR projects. In the US, the tax credit for direct air capture more than tripled last year is one example. And private sector leadership in the form of investments in high quality carbon removal and science-based climate commitments, which can also help accelerate progress. It will also be important to consider equity and sustainability in the siting and deployment of these projects, so as not to perpetuate the past harms caused by large-scale infrastructure deployment, and to make sure CDR scale-up does not result in other environmental and social harms. And so I'll just reiterate, the CDR space is evolving quite rapidly, so I think we can expect to see some of these shifts continuing to happen and hopefully at an accelerating pace in the coming few years. And now I'll pass it to Anderson.
Thank you, Katie. Hi, I'm Anderson Lee from WRI, and I'll be talking about the finance system today. So finance is a key means of enabling action across all the systems we have discussed so far, with investments and aligned financial incentives playing a critical role in either supporting or blocking progress towards our climate, nature, and equity goals. To transform the finance system and align financial flows with these goals, we need to make 6 fundamental shifts. So the first shift is measuring, disclosing, and managing financial risks related to climate and nature. The second is scaling up public finance for climate and nature. And third, very closely related, is scaling up private finance as well. The fourth shift, we need to ensure a just and equitable transition by bringing economic and financial inclusion to underserved and marginalized communities. The fifth shift, the pricing of externalities to reflect their true cost. And 6, eliminating harmful subsidies and financing, speak to the importance of phasing out harmful practices, especially related to fossil fuels, while simultaneously increasing investments on climate and nature solutions. There are many shifts there. Today, I'll highlight shifts 2 and 3, the scaling up of public and private finance for climate and nature. Next slide, please. As referenced earlier by my colleagues, significant investments are required to develop and scale technologies in transportation, industry, carbon removal, to reduce emissions and stop biodiversity loss. The public sector plays a crucial role as they are typically the biggest allocators of capital in our economies, especially when dealing with research and development of high risk and not commercially ready technologies. However, as you can see in the chart on the left, current public climate finance flows are still far below what is required, and estimates suggest they need to grow 4 to 9 times their current volume. Recent legislation such as the Inflation Reduction Act in the US and Europe's anticipated climate spending plans are expected to significantly increase this figure, highlighting the importance of political engagement and continued public pressure on elected officials to increase public investments. As a result, we can expect an increase in public R&D investments in low carbon technologies, which have been stagnant over the years at $24 billion annually, as you can see on the second chart. Increased investments can develop and scale the low carbon technologies that are critical for all the systems we have been discussing today. Next slide, please. So on the flip side, the private sector also has an important role to play in growing investments for climate and nature. Private climate finance is currently at a similar level as the public figure, but it needs to accelerate by more than 10 times to reach the targets needed to limit global warming, as shown on the first chart on the left. There are some positive signs of changing attitudes and behaviors in the corporate sector that will translate to higher investments in climate and nature. So looking at the second chart, we can see a 20% increase last year in the number of corporations with science-based emissions reduction targets validated by the Science Based Targets Initiative, SBTi. This trend is expected to continue growing as civil society and governments keep demanding stronger action from the private sector. So continuing to push for changes in the private sector can result in corporations aligning their business and investment practices with the climate and biodiversity goals we have been discussing, which sets the world to a more sustainable future. So I'll hand it over now to Tapan to demonstrate the platform. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Anderson. I really appreciate you passing over to me. I'm Tapan Parker. I'm with World Resource Institute, and I'll be giving a quick demonstration of our data platform. So I'm really just going to cover some of the basics with this. Definitely feel free to reach out with further questions. If you visited the platform at all, you'll know that right now we only have 5 systems currently available on the platform, with many more coming later this year and into early next year. Our platform covers a lot of what you've been hearing today, including what targets are on track, off track, what are the enablers and barriers that we really need to be monitoring and understanding in order to really make change and take action, as well as some of the stories that we are really excited about and that we're keen to keep an eye on and watch. You can learn more about the different systems we have, and of course, all the different shifts that we're talking about in much more depth as well using the platform. Just to give a sense of what we do offer here. So every system that's currently available has its own separate page where you can dive in and get a summary of everything that's going on, including things like highlights within the system, again, some of those stories that we're looking to watch, looking and seeing which indicators are on track, off track, but moving in the right direction, heading in the wrong direction, or where we just need more data to understand what exactly is happening. Every system as well includes a brief write-up summary that explains in more depth what the system looks like, where things are going, as well as where there might be opportunities to align that system with ongoing work. We also get a bit into what a transformed system might look like for every system by 2030 or 2050 to try and get a sense of what we mean when we say systems change. Every system then also includes a little brief teaser on each of the different shifts that we have available, where you can see what's available, get a sense of what we're talking about with each of the shifts, and so on and so forth. And then further down on each of our system pages, we also include a small chart that gives you a sense of why we're making these assessments of off track, of well off track, or heading in the wrong direction, or even just seeing what kind of data we're showing before you can dive into the larger charts that we have available. If you were to explore one of these shift pages, you would see a very similar setup where, again, we have these highlights, we point to some of the other shifts that are in the system, and then we also have a write-up similar to the system write-up that goes into much more detail on what the shift is, why it's important, why it matters, what changes in that shift would look like before going further down. Again, we then offer those small multiple charts giving you a sense of what are the targets, how are they tracking, but then also starting to get into those enabling factors and barriers that we need to be paying attention to and understanding in order to take action, to have the right incentives for change in each of these indicators. You're also then able to scroll down further and then actually get a full-size write-up for every indicator to get a sense of what exactly is going on. And why things are either off track, how they're trending, what changes might be possible in the future. Every indicator then has a chart, an interactive chart that you're able to scroll through for all of the data that we have available. So for instance, if you were looking at the share of zero carbon sources in electricity generation, you'd be able to see our data as far back as 2000, and then as well, get a sense for the 2030 targets, the 2040 targets, and even the 2050 targets that we have. Some of the additional data that's available here is an assessment of whether or not this indicator has the potential to see exponential change, as well as the acceleration factor needed in order to reach our 2030 targets. You can also download these images to use in your own work or presentations, as well as share a link to these. And as well, just read more on the data source. If you're interested in the methodology behind the indicator, if you're interested in learning more about maybe some of the data challenges that exist, or just seeing where the data and the targets are coming from, that's all made available to you through these different charts. Indicators also tend to have more than just simple timeline information, depending on what data we are able to get. Sometimes in most cases, we have a yearly change outlook to give you a sense of how things have changed year over year. In other cases, we also have country level data, and that's something we're working to expand on for the platform. But where we have it, we provide a map view where you can actually go in and dive in, as well as a drop down to select different countries if you wanted to see, say, how the renewable share of total capacity is trending in Belgium. On the map view, you can actually just see all of these different numbers side by side for every country. And you also have the option of a time slider if you want to see a specific year or just see a quick visual of how things have been trending. Other times, we also offer a disaggregated view, similar to what was shown for that steel indicator. For instance, if we have it where we have it, we can disaggregate by technology and see, for instance, annual capacity additions of renewable energy in certain instances. And we give the same treatment as well to our enablers and barriers. And so you're able to click in and see all this data as well where we have it. You're also always able to navigate on the left-hand side to different sections. So if you're just curious to get into some data insights very quickly, or if you just want to go right to the enablers and barriers, that's always an option. We also have a pretty comprehensive data dashboard where you can really dive in and get a lot more details on everything we have here. This includes our pinwheel from the home page, and this is an interactive version that you can click into and just start to get a sense of all the different trends for these different indicators for a quick assessment of global trends, or just if you want to look at how a system is trending and get those different charts. That's an option. We also have my favorite view, a grid view, which is a searchable list of all of our indicators on the platform. There's quite a lot. And so if you're interested in diving in, just say on electricity, if you're interested in seeing which indicators relate to electricity, not just in one system, but across all systems, you're able to dive in and start to get that cross-system component of how does electricity matter for not just power, but also transport, industry, carbon removal, and so on and so forth. You can also filter down on the left-hand side by specific systems. So if you just want to see for transport and industry, that's an option. You can also filter down by whether or not something is on track or off track. If you're not interested in seeing indicators with no data, or if you're only interested in seeing indicators with no data, that's also an option. You also have access to all of our enablers and barriers here, which there's quite a bit. You can see that there's just tons and tons and tons of data to explore here. And so again, to help you filter down by that, we have this search bar up above where you could say, look for corporate action, where corporate action is needed, or corporate leadership. You're also able again to filter down by category. So if you're just interested in seeing where we need leadership or regulations and incentives for these different areas, you can filter down by that and just look for those specific indicators. There's also a quick tour for this page in case that's helpful for you to get a sense of how to use everything and where things are located. We also have the option to download all of our data. So if you don't want to look at the visuals, or if you want to combine this with data that you have to get a sense of how your initiatives can work within this, you have an option to filter down by the data we have available, or just click download all and get everything that we have. You can also always reach our publications and get a sense of all the things we're publishing, see everything we have available, as well as more on our methodology, how we chose our indicators, how we came to the determination on what's on track or off track, or why we don't have an assessment yet for some indicators, and as well as just some more information on what is systems change, or information on the other shifts that we have coming in one place for all of our different systems. Apart from that, we also have a section where you can get more updates on news and events we have coming. We have our newsletter that you can subscribe to if you're not already, as well as just indicating whether or not you're interested in participating in user testing, which we're constantly doing for new features. And then, of course, you can read more about us in frequently asked questions and who we are, or just reach out to us with questions. Thanks. I'll pass it over to Rachel.
Thanks so much, everybody. So we have a few minutes left for Q&A. We've been getting an incredible amount of questions in the chat. So thank you so much for those. Keep those coming. Because if we don't get to them now, happy to do follow-up to help answer them afterward. I wonder, Kelly, I'll batch a few of these to you because a couple of them are related. And I think we've been answering this first one in the chat, but we get this question a lot. So just would be happy to share it with everyone here. The question around, can the platform also zoom into developments per country or region, or only global? So Kelly, if you want to take that one.
Sure, great. It's a great question. So we started off looking at global data, but if the data sets that we've found have national data, we have included them, and the analysis is going to get prettier over the course of this year. But basically having a drop down where you could see the global data, but then you could also sort by countries. And one of the biggest challenges we've found is that we don't have comprehensive data sets for all countries. So in some cases, you won't see that. What we don't have now, and maybe it's something in the future, is could you see a System Change Lab dashboard for the United States or for India? It would be fun to think about that. At the moment, we don't have that, but it's an interesting idea. The one piece of analysis and research that we're going to be focusing on a lot this year is drawing out some of the national level insights throughout the platform. And that could be kind of complementary knowledge products. But let's take an issue like coal phase out. Where have we seen coal phase out actually happen pretty quickly over the course of a few years? Why has that happened? What are the kind of enablers of change? And across the different shifts that we cover here, we're going to be looking and diving in a lot into some of the national data and thinking through who are the leaders, who are the laggers, and what are the greatest barriers? How have they been overcome in certain jurisdictions? So that's more to come this year.
Great. And then two more to pepper you with, Kelly. So we get this next question a lot too. Why are some indicators considered on or off track and others don't have a status? That's one. And then understanding systems change requires, of course, that we understand connections between systems and also within, just as we teed up in the introduction. Why is that not included yet? So it was one of the key questions you've mentioned for this year.
Great. So in terms of the ones that don't have a status, so there are two types of indicators that we're looking at. One are what we kind of call target indicators. At face value, how is a shift happening or not happening? So say, phase out the internal combustion engine, the number of EVs on the road, can we track progress towards that? But we also, as we laid out in the beginning, have some indicators of the enablers and the barriers for each one of these shifts. We only track progress towards targets for those targets on those outcome level indicators of how the shift is doing. And we don't do it for the enablers and barriers because often we actually don't have targets for those of, corporate leadership or government leadership that are aligned with the science, but we can track historical progress. And are we heading in the right direction? Are we heading in the wrong direction? There are some targets that we just don't have sufficient data for though, and we've marked that throughout the entire platform. And the other thing in terms of connections, this is a big focus of our work this year. As Rachel had laid out in the beginning, you can't think about system change without thinking about the connections between these different shifts and what are the dependencies, what are the co-benefits, what are the, you pull a lever here and it could have impacts there. And this is a piece of work that we're going to be focusing on in the coming months. And for those who are interested in, please be in touch. We would really love to get your thoughts.
Great. I think I can sneak in a couple more Q&As. So Stephen, maybe I'll pass this next one to you as it's related to the transport system. So the question around transport being a major source of GHG emissions globally, but also within Africa. EVs can bring 3 wins: GHG reduction, reduction in urban air pollution, and saving on foreign currency for petroleum. How can we accelerate penetrations for EVs in Africa? What should we do?
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. I think, acknowledging that Africa is made up of, quite a few different countries with different kind of situations, but I think what we're most likely to see here is in Africa, much like that we're seeing in Asia, there are relatively low motorization rates, relatively low sort of ownership of cars per people. Very few African countries have over 100 cars per 1,000 people, which compare it to like the European Union, which is 560 per 1,000 people, which is significant difference. But 2- and 3-wheelers, such as motorcycles and tuk-tuks, I'm not sure what the sort of other names for that is, but are quite a bit more popular in Africa, as well as I said, Asia. And it is most likely that we're going to see a much stronger effort there in electrifying these 2- and 3-wheelers because it is generally easier. There is a smaller price premium. It is a little bit easier to cover with, tax benefits or other sorts of economic incentives, as well as perhaps we may see, increasing, multilateral development bank funding or kind of help from high-income countries to be able to, as you say, reduce some of those GHG emissions, reduce air pollution, and even, reduce some of the expenses of importing a lot of, frankly, higher polluting cars from other countries as well.
Great, thanks, Stephen. I'll actually go ahead and take a crack at a couple of these questions that we've seen in the Q&A. We also get this question a lot. When will data for food, land, and oceans be available? So our social ecological systems, as well as those cross-cutting transformations ranging from good governance, new economics, circular economy, and on, are all coming towards the fall. So looking to have the majority of those either by COP28 or by the end of the calendar year. So really excited to bring all 14 systems on eventually. But yeah, as we've been saying, prototype, really excited for your thoughts and feedback as we bring these systems online. And then another really great question around basically our outreach and communications and how stakeholders are being involved. An open invitation. If you have thoughts and ideas for this is absolutely a collaborative effort. As Kelly was saying at the top, we can't do this alone, and we're going to need to network into all of the ecosystems that we were talking about before to help enable and encourage and play an authentic role with you, alongside you, supporting your work. So really excited to do that together. A few of those examples might be how we're supporting the high-level champions team and ensuring that we're bringing the latest insights from what we've shown you here today to their work and supporting their efforts. Likewise, our partnerships and crowding around how do we learn more and broaden the research agenda around positive tipping points, and doing that with University of Exeter, Systemic, and many others crowding into that key question. So these are just a couple of really quick examples, but would welcome if folks have ideas for how we can collaborate. That's going to be absolutely vital to making the work that we're doing that much more impactful. Great. I know we have 2 minutes left. Panel, really excited to see if there's any final questions that are speaking to you, or any final thoughts of what's giving us hope in these next 7 years towards 2030 as a key milestone or moment.
Well, I think, Rachel, we are seeing some bright spots of action. I think most of our platform is, you see a lot of red across it in terms of being off track, or, not quite there yet, yellow and orange, and not a lot of green on track. But I do think that when you dive into some of the national data, you start to see some nonlinear change in some of the systems. You take EVs, you take renewables, and what have you. And I think what's going to be essential for us is to think about the ingredients of that transformational change. What enabled that, and what can we learn from that? And then how do we take those lessons to actually spark change? And I think that's what we're all about in terms of not just monitoring system change, but doing it, because this is the decisive decade.
Exactly right. Well, wonderful. We'll close with that as we're approaching the top of the hour. Just a huge thank you to everyone for joining us again today. We've scratched the surface with what we've been able to share in this hour, but really looking forward to your continued questions, thoughts, feedback, and see you soon. Thank you so much for joining us.